The photograph arrived in a manila envelope with no return address. Inside, a single image, black and white, edges softened by time. A factory floor somewhere in Germany, 1944. Rows of women at workstations, their heads bent over machinery, hands moving in the rhythm of wartime production. The light came from high windows filtered through industrial dust, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. At first glance, it was ordinary. Another wartime factory. Another group of anonymous workers contributing to a machine too large to stop. But something made me pause. In the far corner, barely visible beneath a canvas tarp, the outline of something that didn't belong. Not ammunition, not airplane parts, not the expected machinery of war. It looked like furniture. Delicate furniture. I brought the photograph closer to the lamp on my desk, squinting at the grain. The women's faces were indistinct, blurred by motion or poor exposure. But their postures told a different story. Shoulders tight, eyes averted from the camera. One woman, second row from the left, had her hand pressed against her stomach as if steadying herself. Another woman stood near the corner where the tarp hung, her gaze fixed not on her work but on whatever lay beneath that canvas. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between resignation and defiance. The factory identification stamp on the back was partially obscured by water damage, but I could make out fragments. Schwarzwald region, winter, 1944. The Black Forest. I had inherited this photograph from my late grandfather, a Dutch journalist who had spent years documenting forgotten stories of the war. Among his papers, I found only a single notation. Ask about the cradles. No one will answer. Cradles. I contacted the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, sending a high-resolution scan. 3 weeks later, an archivist named Klaus Hoffmann called me. His voice was measured, careful. "This photograph," he said, "should not exist." "What do you mean?" "The factory was destroyed in 1945. Deliberately. All records were burned before the Allies arrived. We have no documentation of what was produced there." He paused, and I heard papers rustling. "But we have rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that old men whisper in beer halls when they think no one is listening. The kind that appear in fragments of testimony that never made it into official records." Klaus agreed to meet me in Freiburg, near the forest where the factory once stood. When we met at a cafe near the cathedral, he brought a thin folder of documents. Requisition orders with sections redacted, transport logs with destinations marked only as SW14, fragments of testimonies from Nuremberg trials that had been excluded from final proceedings. "These women," he said, laying the photograph on the table between us, "were not German." "Who were they?" "Prisoners. Brought from France, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands. Young women mostly. Arrived in late 1943, transported under Category 4 classification." "What's Category 4? Klaus looked out the window at the cathedral spire, then back at me. It was a classification that officially didn't exist. Used for prisoners whose labor served what they called biological imperatives of the Reich. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "The requisition orders," Klaus continued, sliding a brittle page toward me, "show materials being sent to this facility. Oak wood, soft cotton, wool blankets. None of it industrial, none of it military." He pointed to a line item. "And here, medical supplies. Not for injuries, for childbirth." I looked at the photograph again. The woman with her hand on her stomach. The loose dresses. The averted eyes. "This factory," I said slowly, "wasn't making weapons." "No. What were they building?" Klaus tapped the corner of the photograph, where the canvas tarp hung over those mysterious shapes. "Cradles," he said quietly. "They were building cradles. And the question no one wanted to answer was this: for whose children?" The cafe seemed suddenly too warm, too bright. I looked at the faces of those 17 women again. Their bent heads, their careful distance from one another. The way they seemed to occupy the frame without truly inhabiting it. "I need to find out who they were," I said. Klaus nodded slowly. "There's a woman. Lives in a village near where the factory stood. She was a girl during the war, but she remembers things. Her grandmother worked as a midwife in the region." He wrote an address on a napkin. "Her name is Margareta Klein. She's 93 now. If she'll speak to you, she might be the only person left who knows the truth. Will she speak to me?" "That depends," Klaus said. on whether she believes the truth still matters. I left Freiburg the next morning, driving into the Black Forest as snow began to fall. The address led me to a small village with a church dating back to the 15th century and houses that seemed to grow directly from the hillside. Margaret Klein lived alone in a cottage surrounded by pine trees. When she opened the door, her eyes went immediately to the envelope in my hand. "You brought the photograph," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've seen it before?" "Once. A long time ago." She stepped aside. "Come in. If you're here asking about the factory, you should hear the whole story. But I warn you, it's not the story you think you're looking for." Inside, her cottage smelled of wood smoke and chamomile tea. She moved slowly to a chair by the window and gestured for me to sit. "Show me," she said. I laid the photograph on the table. She looked at it for a long moment, her finger hovering over the faces without quite touching them. "I knew 3 of these women," she said finally. "They came to our village sometimes, escorted by guards to see my grandmother. She was the midwife." Margaretta's voice dropped. "They came because they were pregnant." The room seemed to hold its breath. "All of them?" I asked. "Most of them. That was why they were there. And the cradles they were building," I said slowly, "were for their own children?" Margaret looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw something that made my blood run cold. "No," she whispered. "They were building cradles for children they would never be allowed to keep." I stayed in the village that night, in a small guest house that rented rooms above a bakery. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing the photograph. Those 17 faces, the loose dresses, the hand pressed protectively against a stomach, the cradles hidden beneath canvas in the corner, built by hands that would never rock the children meant to sleep in them. In the morning, Margaret agreed to continue our conversation. "You have to understand the time," she said as we sat again in her cottage. 1943, 1944. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. The factories needed workers, yes, but the Reich also needed something else. She paused. Population. Pure population. The future. Lebensborn, I said. She nodded. "You know about that. The maternity homes. The program to increase Aryan births. But what most people don't know is that Lebensborn had variations, experiments, facilities that operated in the shadows, without official documentation. Like this factory. Yes, it was called Waldhof, Forest Court, a name that appeared on no maps. Margaret stood slowly and went to a wooden chest by the window. From it she withdrew a small cardboard box. My grandmother kept records. Nothing official, just notes. Names, dates. She knew what was happening was wrong, but she was also afraid. If she refused to help, they would bring someone else. Someone who might not be gentle. Inside the box were scraps of paper covered in faded handwriting. Dates from 1943 to 1945. Names, first names only. Nationalities, due dates, Marie, French, April 1944, Kazia, Polish, June 1944, Johanna, Dutch, August 1944. These were the women in the photograph? I asked. Some of them. My grandmother attended perhaps a dozen births from that facility over 2 years. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she touched the papers. She said the women were always escorted, always quiet. They never cried out during labor, as if they'd been trained to suffer in silence. I thought of the woman in the photograph looking toward the corner, toward the cradles. What happened to the babies? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. That, she said, is where the story becomes difficult to speak aloud. She told me that the babies born to these women were assessed immediately after birth. Measurements taken. Hair and eye color recorded. Physical features catalogued with clinical precision. If the child met certain criteria, so blonde hair, blue eyes, proper bone structure, it was taken within hours, sent somewhere else, given to German families desperate for children, families with the right connections to the party. Adopted? Stolen, Margaret corrected. Given new names, new birth certificates, raised as pure German children with no knowledge of their true mothers. And if the child didn't meet the criteria, her silence was answer enough. I looked down at the photograph again, my hands unsteady. The women in this factory, they were forced to. Some were, Margaret said carefully. assaulted by soldiers, officers, guards. Others, she trailed off. Others were part of what they called breeding programs, matched with SS men deemed genetically suitable. It was clinical, systematic, evil dressed in the language of science and duty. I felt sick. And the cradles? A cruel efficiency. The women were kept working as long as physically possible, building furniture, including cradles, for the Lebensborn homes and for German families. They were building the very objects that would hold the children taken from them. I stood and walked to the window, needing air, needing distance from the weight of what I was learning. Outside, snow fell softly through the pines. How many women passed through Waldhof? I asked. We don't know. My grandmother's notes account for perhaps 30 births over 2 years, but there were transport logs suggesting many more arrived. Some gave birth. Others, Margaret's voice dropped. Others didn't survive the labor, or the conditions. Winter in that factory was brutal. Little heat, poor food, and after giving birth, the women were expected to return to work within days. Why hasn't this been documented? It was. Fragments exist. But after the war, there was enormous pressure to move forward, to rebuild. Stories like this, they were buried. Literally. When the Allies approached, the factory was evacuated in a single night. The women were moved to an unknown location. The building was set on fire. By the time investigators arrived, there was nothing but ash and twisted metal. And the women? Margaret met my eyes. We don't know. Some may have been sent to camps. Some may have been killed. A very few might have survived and returned home, though they would have had every reason never to speak of what happened. I returned to the table and studied the photograph with new understanding. 17 faces, 17 women whose names I didn't know, whose stories had been erased as efficiently as the factory itself. But one detail kept drawing my attention. The woman looking toward the corner, toward the cradles. Her expression wasn't just resignation. There was something else. Something intentional. Margaret, I said slowly. This photograph. Who took it? She tilted her head. What do you mean? Factory photographs were official. Propaganda. They showed productivity, order, contribution to the war effort. But this, I pointed to the composition. The way it's framed. The way it captures the corner with the cradles. The faces of the women. This wasn't taken by a Nazi photographer documenting production quotas. Margaret leaned forward, studying the image with fresh eyes. You're right, she said slowly. The angle is wrong. The focus is too human. Someone took this photograph secretly, I said. Someone who wanted to document what was really happening. Someone who wanted the truth to survive. But who? I thought of my grandfather's note. Ask about the cradles. No one will answer. I think, I said, someone inside that factory knew this needed to be remembered. And I think if we look closely enough at this photograph, we might find out who. I lifted the magnifying glass to the image once more, scanning the faces, the machinery, the shadows. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection of a metal machine surface, barely visible, distorted but unmistakable. The silhouette of someone holding a camera, someone who shouldn't have been there. The reflection in the metal was no larger than a fingerprint, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. I scanned the photograph at the highest resolution my equipment allowed and isolated the section, a curved surface of what appeared to be an industrial press, polished enough to catch light and shadow. In that distorted mirror, a figure stood at an angle the official photographer shouldn't have occupied. The silhouette was slender, arms raised, holding what was unmistakably a camera. Someone else was there, I said, showing Margaret the enhanced image on my laptop screen. She squinted at it, then sat back slowly. 2 photographers, one official, one hidden. Or one photographer who wasn't supposed to be taking this particular picture. I spent the next week tracking down every scrap of information about Waldhof. Klaus sent me files from Berlin, transport manifests, requisition orders, payroll records. Most were fragmentary, pages torn or deliberately obscured. But one document caught my attention. A quarterly report from January 1944 listing facility personnel, factory supervisor, medical officer, guards, kitchen staff, and one entry that seemed out of place. Documentation specialist, G. Richter. Documentation specialist. a bureaucratic title that could mean anything or nothing. I called Klaus. Do we have any information on a G. Richter assigned to Waldhof in 1944? Papers rustled on his end. Let me check the personnel archives. A pause. Here. Gerhard Richter. No, wait. Greta Richter. Female. Age 29 in 1944. Assigned to Waldhof in November 1943 as administrative staff. What did administrative staff do at these facilities? Paperwork, records, photographing inventory and production for quarterly reports to Berlin. Klaus paused. Why? Because I think she took this photograph. I found 3 other photographs in the archives bearing Waldhof's identification stamp. All were official. Wide shots of the factory floor, properly lit, showing orderly rows of workers and finished products. Standard propaganda imagery. Each was credited to Documentation Department, Waldhof facility. But the photograph I held was different. The lighting was natural, not staged. The composition captured something raw and human, and it had never been filed in any official archive. My grandfather had it, which meant someone had given it to him. I went through his papers again more carefully this time. In a folder marked Unresolved, 1947, I found a letter dated March 1947, written in German. The handwriting was careful, feminine. Dear Mr. Van Doren, I am writing to you because I believe you are someone who seeks truth rather than comfort. I worked during the war in a place I cannot name in official records. I saw things that must be remembered, even if they can never be forgiven. I have one photograph. It is all that remains. If you are willing to tell this story, I will trust you with it. Gr. Greta Richter. The letter included an address in Stuttgart. I searched German post-war records and found her. Greta Richter, born 1915, died 1989. Unmarried. No children. She had worked after the war as a librarian at a Stuttgart secondary school. But I found something else. In 1961, Greta had given testimony to a war crimes investigation committee looking into Lebensborn programs. Her testimony had been recorded but never used in trials. The document was sealed, marked non-evidentiary, personal account only. It took 2 weeks and a formal request through my press credentials to access it. The testimony was 8 pages long, typed on thin paper, filled with legal language and careful redactions. But the core of it was devastating. I was assigned to Waldhof in November 1943 as a documentation specialist. My role was to photograph production and maintain records. What I found there was not production in any conventional sense. The women were prisoners, foreign nationals, mostly young, many pregnant or made pregnant while in custody. They were forced to labor building furniture, including cradles and bassinets, which were sent to Lebensborn homes in German families. I was ordered to photograph the facility for quarterly reports. I took the required images, but I also took others, photographs that showed the truth. I hid these negatives in my personal belongings. When the facility was evacuated in February 1945, I took them with me. I kept them because I believed someone, someday, would need to know what happened there. Not the sanitized version, the real version. The faces of the women, the cradles they built, the children they would never hold. Most of my negatives were destroyed in the bombing of Stuttgart in 1945. Only one survived. I sent it to a Dutch journalist I met after the war who I believed would honor the truth. I do not know if he ever told the story. I hope he did. If not, I hope someone will. My grandfather never published the story. I found drafts in his papers, abandoned and rewritten multiple times. In the margins of one draft he had written, "How do you tell a story this dark without exploiting the suffering? How do you honor the women without turning them into symbols?" He never found the answer. The photograph had stayed in his files for decades. Now it was in my hands. I contacted the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt, an organization dedicated to researching Nazi crimes. A historian named Dr. Elisabeth Kraus agreed to examine the photograph and Greta's testimony. "This is significant," she said when we spoke by phone. "We have very little documentation of these auxiliary Lebensborn facilities. Waldhof was rumored to exist, but we had no proof. This photograph is proof. Can we identify any of the women? Possibly, if we cross-reference with transport records and surviving testimonies from other camps and facilities." She paused. But I must warn you, most of these women, if they survived, never spoke publicly about what happened. The shame imposed on them was immense. In their home countries, they were often treated as collaborators rather than victims. So even if we find them, they may not want to be found. Yes. Still, Dr. Kraus agreed to help. Over the next month, we worked through transport logs from France, Poland, and the Netherlands. We found records of young women sent to labor assignments in the Schwarzwald region in late 1943 and early 1944. Most were listed only by identification numbers and nationalities. But 3 names emerged with enough corroborating detail to be potential matches. Marie Blanchard, French, age 19, arrested in Lyon in August 1943 for resistance activities. Sent to labor camp, then transferred to SW-14 in November 1943. Katarzyna Nowak, Polish, age 22, taken from her village near Krakow in October 1943 during a roundup. Last known location, Schwarzwald work detail. Johanna van der Meer, Dutch, age 24, arrested in Amsterdam in September 1943 for hiding Jewish refugees. Transported to Germany, destination unspecified. Dr. Kraus found post-war records for 2 of them. Marie Blanchard returned to France in June 1945. She lived in a small town in Brittany until her death in 2003. She never married. In her obituary, there was a single line: Marie lived a quiet life of service and prayer. Katarzyna Nowak's trail went cold. No post-war records in Poland. No death certificate. No immigration documents. But Johanna van der Meer survived. She returned to the Netherlands in 1945 and later immigrated to Canada in 1951. She married, had 2 children, and worked as a nurse in Toronto until her retirement in 1982. She died in 2019, but she had a daughter. Dr. Kraus found an obituary listing surviving family members. One name, Anna Thornton, Toronto. I found Anna's contact information through public records and sent a carefully worded letter explaining who I was and what I had discovered. I included a copy of the photograph, though I didn't specify which woman might be her mother. 3 weeks passed with no response. Then, late one evening, my phone rang. Canadian area code. "This is Anna Thornton," the voice said. "You sent me a letter about my mother." My heart raced. "Yes, thank you for calling. I'm looking at the photograph now," she said. Her voice was steady but strained. "My mother never spoke about the war. Not once. She would leave the room if anyone mentioned it. After she died, we found a box in her closet. Letters, documents, and a single photograph. The same photograph? No, a different one. But it was taken in the same place. I'm certain of it." "Miss Thornton," I said carefully, "do you know what happened to your mother during the war?" There was a long silence. "I know she was in Germany. I know she was imprisoned. And I know..." Her voice broke slightly. "I know I had a brother." "A brother?" "My mother gave birth in Germany in 1944. A boy. She never saw him again. She carried that grief her entire life." My hands went cold. "The photograph you have," I said. "Can you send it to me?" "I can do better than that," Anna said. "I can bring it to you." Because written on the back, in my mother's handwriting, are 3 words. What words? They took everything. Waldhof Facility, Black Forest, Germany, November 1943. The train arrived at night. Johanna van der Meer stood pressed against 30 other women in a cattle car that smelled of fear and urine and the sharp cold of approaching winter. When the doors finally opened, the shock of frozen air was almost a relief. "Out! Quickly!" Guards with rifles and dogs, shouting in German. Women stumbling down onto gravel, legs weak from 3 days of standing. Johanna kept her head down and moved with the group. Survival rule number 1, learned in the first days after her arrest. Don't stand out, don't resist, don't give them a reason to remember your face. They were marched through a forest road, pine trees black against a starless sky. The only sound was boots on frozen ground and the occasional whimper from someone too exhausted or frightened to stay silent. After 20 minutes, they reached a gate. Beyond it, a low concrete building with narrow windows that glowed yellow in the darkness. It looked more like a factory than a prison. Above the entrance, a sign, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. Johanna had seen those words before. Everyone had. They meant nothing, or they meant everything depending on how much hope you still carried. Inside, they were processed, names recorded, belongings confiscated, heads shaved, clothing replaced with identical gray dresses that hung loose and shapeless. A woman in a nurse's uniform moved down the line with a clipboard, asking questions in clipped German. Age? 24. Health conditions? None. Last menstrual period? Johanna hesitated. The questions seemed too intimate, too specific. Answer, the nurse said impatiently. 3 weeks ago. The nurse made a notation and moved on. They were assigned to dormitory barracks, long rooms lined with metal cots, thin blankets, a single stove in the center that did nothing against the cold seeping through the walls. Johanna lay on her cot that first night, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to understand where she was and what would happen next. A woman in the next cot whispered to her in French. "You speak French?" "A little," Johanna replied in the same language. "What did they arrest you for?" "Hiding Jews." "You?" "Resistance. They caught me with pamphlets." The woman's voice was young, maybe younger than Johanna. "My name is Marie." "Johanna, do you know what this place is?" "A labor camp." "Yes, but—" Marie hesitated. "The nurse asked me about my cycle, and when we were undressing, she examined some of the women, looking at their bodies, their hips." Johanna felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I think," Marie whispered, "they brought us here for a reason that has nothing to do with labor." In the morning, they were taken to the factory floor. It was vast, high ceilings, rows of workstations, the smell of sawdust and machine oil. The women were divided into groups and assigned tasks. Johanna was placed at a station with 3 other women, shown how to sand and finish wooden slats. "You are building furniture," the supervisor said in heavily accented French. "Cradles, bassinets, cribs. You will work 6 days each week, 10 hours each day. You will meet your quota. If you do not, rations will be reduced." Cradles. Johanna looked at the pieces of wood in front of her, the curved slats that would become the rails of an infant's bed, and felt something twist inside her chest. The work was monotonous but not physically unbearable. The factory was cold, but they were indoors. The food was minimal, thin soup, black bread, weak coffee, but it was regular. For 2 weeks, Johanna worked and slept and tried not to think beyond the next day. Then the doctor came. All the women were called to the medical room in groups of 5. Johanna went with Marie and 3 Polish women whose names she didn't yet know. The doctor was a man in his 50s, gray-haired, clinical in his manner. A nurse assisted him. "Undress," he said without looking at them. They undressed. The examination was thorough and humiliating. Measurements, weight, questions about health history, family history, menstrual cycles. He examined their teeth, their skin, their hair. He measured the width of their hips with calipers. When he came to Johanna, he paused. "You are Dutch?" "Yes." "Height?" 168 centimeters. He made notations. Hair color before shaving? Blonde. Eye color? Blue. More notations. Then he moved on. When they were dressed again and dismissed, Marie grabbed Johanna's arm as they walked back to the barracks. "Did you see the way he looked at you? At me? At some of the others?" "What do you mean?" "He was selecting us. Like livestock." Marie's voice shook. "I heard the nurse say something to him. A word I didn't understand. Züchtung." Johanna's German wasn't fluent, but she knew enough. Breeding. That night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of women breathing in the dark, and she understood with terrible clarity why they had been brought to this place. Not for their labor, for their bodies, for children they would be forced to bear. 3 days later, Johanna was called from the factory floor by a guard. "Come with me." Her heart hammered. She followed him through corridors she hadn't seen before, to a section of the building that was warmer, cleaner. He opened a door and pushed her inside. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a table, and a man. He stood by the window in an SS uniform, young, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that might have been handsome in another context. Now it just looked cold. He turned and looked at her without expression. "Sit," he said in German. Johanna remained standing. I said sit. She sat. He studied her for a long moment, then spoke in slow, deliberate sentences. You have been selected for a program of importance to the Reich. You are healthy. You meet the physical criteria. You will participate. There is no choice in this matter. If you resist, you will be sent somewhere much worse than this. Do you understand? Johanna said nothing. Do you understand? Yes. Good. He moved toward the door. You will remain here tonight. Someone will bring you food. Tomorrow you will return to the factory. In 1 month you will be examined again. If you are pregnant, you will continue working until the 5th month. Then you will be transferred to the medical wing. After the birth, if the child meets requirements, it will be placed with a suitable family. You will return to work. This is how it will be. He left. Johanna sat in the chair, staring at the wall, feeling something inside her break and go numb. She was 24 years old. She had survived arrest, interrogation, transport. But this was something different. This was a violation that had no name. And somewhere in the factory below, 30 other women were learning the same truth. Waldhof Facility, Black Forest, Germany, February 1944. Johanna knew she was pregnant before the doctor confirmed it. The nausea came first, then the exhaustion that made even standing at her workstation feel like moving through deep water. Her body was changing in ways that should have brought joy, but instead brought only dread. When the examination confirmed what she already knew, the doctor made a notation in her file without looking at her face. You will continue standard work until the 20th week. Then you'll be transferred to light duty. Light duty meant the sewing room, making linens, blankets, small garments. It also meant you were visible, marked. Everyone knew what you were carrying and why. Marie had been confirmed pregnant 2 weeks before Johanna. So had Katarzyna, one of the Polish women. By March, 11 women in the facility were showing. They didn't speak about it openly. The shame was too heavy, the reality too impossible to name. But at night, lying in their cots, Johanna sometimes heard someone crying softly in the darkness. The factory work continued around them. Every day more cradles, more bassinets, delicate furniture built by hands that trembled with exhaustion and rage and grief. Johanna sanded the wooden slats until they were smooth as glass. She assembled the pieces with small nails and wood glue. She watched as each finished cradle was carried away to the storage area, tagged for shipment to some family in Berlin or Munich or Stuttgart. A family that wanted a child. A family that would never know where that child came from. In her 5th month, Johanna was moved to the sewing room as promised. The work was easier physically, but harder in every other way. She sat at a long table with 7 other pregnant women, stitching tiny shirts and blankets while their bodies grew heavier with children they would never raise. One afternoon in April, a new woman joined their work detail. She was different from the factory supervisors. Younger, perhaps 30, with careful eyes and a camera hanging from her shoulder. She wore civilian clothes beneath a work smock, and she moved through the factory with a clipboard, taking photographs of machinery and production outputs. Documentation specialist, one of the guards explained when someone asked. Her name was Greta. She photographed the factory systematically over several days. The workstations, the finished products, the orderly rows of women at their tasks. Official documentation for quarterly reports to Berlin. But Johanna noticed something. Greta's hands shook slightly when she photographed the pregnant women. And once, when their eyes met across the sewing room, Johanna saw something in that gaze that looked like horror carefully hidden. The official photographer took her pictures and moved on to other sections. But 3 days later, Greta returned. She came during the afternoon shift when the supervisor had stepped out for his break. She moved quietly to the corner of the factory floor where the finished cradles were stored under canvas tarps, waiting for shipment. She lifted her camera. Everyone looked natural, she said softly in German, not looking at them directly. Continue working. Don't acknowledge the camera. The women bent over their tasks as instructed. But Johanna, sitting at her sewing station near the back, turned her head slightly. Just enough to look toward the corner where Greta stood, toward the cradles. The shutter clicked. Greta lowered the camera quickly and left without another word. That night, Johanna lay awake wondering what would become of that photograph. Whether it would be filed away like all the others, or whether Greta had taken it for a different reason. Whether someone someday would see those faces and understand what had happened here. The births began in May. Marie was first. She was taken to the medical wing in the middle of a work shift, her water having broken while she stood at her station. She didn't cry out. She just put down her tools and walked toward the guard who had come to collect her. She returned to the dormitory 3 days later, hollow-eyed and silent. The other women knew better than to ask questions. But that night, in the darkness, Marie whispered across the space between cots. It was a boy. Blonde. Blue eyes. They took him 6 hours after he was born. I didn't even get to hold him properly. Just once for a moment while they did the measurements. Her voice cracked. He looked like my brother. My little brother who died when we were children. The same face. Johanna reached across the gap and found Marie's hand in the darkness. They held on to each other and said nothing. Over the next 3 months, the other births followed. Katarzyna gave birth to a girl. Taken. A French woman named Sophie had a boy. Taken. Each time the same process. Measurements, assessment, documentation. And then the baby was removed to an unknown destination, while the mother was returned to work within days, her breasts still leaking milk, her body torn and healing, her arms empty. Johanna's time came in August. The labor started just before dawn, slow at first, then building into waves of pain that made her bite down on a rag to keep from screaming. She was taken to the medical wing, a cold room with a metal table and bright lights that hurt her eyes. The midwife was an older German woman, efficient and not unkind, but distant. She had delivered dozens of babies in this facility. She knew not to let herself care. Push, she said calmly. Johanna pushed. 12 hours later, as afternoon light filtered through the high window, her son was born. They placed him on her chest for exactly 43 seconds while they cut the cord and checked his breathing. Johanna looked at his face. Small, red, perfect, and felt something break apart inside her chest that she knew would never be whole again. His eyes were closed. His mouth made small movements as if searching for something. She touched his cheek. Hello, she whispered in Dutch. Hello, kleine Jongen. Little boy. Then the midwife lifted him away. Strong. Healthy. Good coloring, the doctor said, examining him on the table. He measured the baby's head, his length, checked his features with clinical precision. Weight? 3.4 kilograms. Acceptable. The doctor made notations. Category 1. Suitable for placement. Category 1. The highest designation. The most desirable. Johanna watched from the table, still bleeding, still trembling, as they wrapped her son in a white cloth and carried him through a door that closed with a soft click. She never saw him again. They kept her in the medical wing for 2 days, then sent her back to the factory floor. She returned to her workstation and picked up her tools. Around her, other women sanded wood and assembled cradles. No one spoke. No one met her eyes. They all knew. At night, Johanna lay in her cot and stared at the ceiling and wondered if her son was warm, if someone was holding him, if he was crying for her and no one came. She wondered if they had given him a German name. She wondered if he would grow up believing he was someone else's child, if he would ever know the truth. The war continued. Summer turned to autumn. More women arrived. More births. More children disappeared into the machinery of the Reich's future. And in the corner of the factory, beneath canvas tarps, the cradles continued to multiply, built by the hands of women whose arms would remain empty forever. Toronto, Canada. Present day. Anna Thornton met me at a cafe near her home in North York. She was in her 60s, composed and professional, but I could see the strain around her eyes. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm, and when she sat down across from me, she placed it on the table carefully, as if it contained something fragile. Thank you for coming all this way, I said. I needed to see you in person, to know you're serious about this, that you'll treat her story with respect. I will. I promise. Anna nodded slowly, then opened the portfolio. Inside was a photograph, different from the one I had, but unmistakably from the same place. It showed a group of women in a dormitory, sitting on metal cots. Their faces were worn, exhausted. Several were visibly pregnant. One of them was looking directly at the camera. That's my mother, Anna said, pointing to the woman. Johanna van der Meer. She was 24 when this was taken. I studied the face. Young, blonde hair growing back in after being shaved. Blue eyes that held something between defiance and despair. Where did she get this photograph? It was sent to her after the war, 1947, in a letter from someone she never named. My mother kept it hidden for decades. After she died, my brother and I found it in a box with other documents. Her arrest record, her deportation papers, a Red Cross letter confirming her return to Holland in 1945. Anna pulled out another sheet of paper. And this. It was a medical record, typed in German, dated August 12, 1944. Patient, Johanna van der Meer, prisoner, Darsh SW14, 3847. Birth, male infant, 3.4 kilo, 51 centimeters classification, category 1. Status, removed for placement, August 12, 1944, 1500 hours. Destination, Lebensbornheim. Steinhöring. She kept the record, Anna said quietly. All these years. She never spoke about it, but she kept it. I read the document again, feeling the weight of it. Steinhöring. That was one of the largest Lebensborn homes. In Bavaria. I researched it after my mother died, Anna said. I tried to find records, to see if there was any way to trace what happened to the baby. But the Steinhöring records were mostly destroyed. Some were taken by the Allies. Some were burned by the staff before they evacuated. What survived is fragmented and incomplete. Did your mother ever try to find him? Anna's eyes filled. I don't know. She never told us she had a son. My brother and I only found out after she died. But there were things. She paused. Every year on August 12th, my mother would be distant, quiet. She'd go to church alone and light a candle. We thought it was for someone who died in the war. We never knew it was a birthday she was marking. I thought of Johanna in that cold medical room, holding her son for 43 seconds before he was taken away. The photograph I have, I said, shows the factory floor. Your mother is in it, I think, looking toward a corner where cradles were stored. Can I see it? I pulled out my copy and laid it beside Anna's photograph. She studied it for a long moment, then pointed to a figure in the back, partially turned toward the corner. That's her. That's my mother's posture, the way she held her shoulders. We sat in silence, looking at these two fragments of the same horror. What happened to the other women? Anna asked. We've been able to trace a few. Marie Blanchard returned to France. She never married, never spoke publicly about what happened. Died in 2003. Katarzyna Nowak disappeared. No records after 1945. Others, I trailed off. Most don't want to be found. Can't be found. The shame was too great. Shame, Anna repeated bitterly. They were victims. They should never have been made to feel shame. No, but they were. By their communities, their families. Sometimes even by the Allied investigators who couldn't quite see them as anything other than collaborators. I paused. Your mother was brave to survive it, to build a life afterward. She was, Anna said. But she never healed from it. Not really. My father told me once, years after they married, that she would wake up crying sometimes, reaching for something that wasn't there. He never knew why. Now I do. She pulled out one more document from the portfolio. I found this in my mother's handwriting, written in Dutch. I had it translated. It was a letter, undated, written on thin paper in careful script. To my son, I don't know your name. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you're alive, but I want you to know that I held you. For 43 seconds, I held you. And in that time, I loved you more than I have ever loved anything in this world. They took you because you were perfect. Blue eyes, blonde hair, healthy and strong. Everything they wanted for their future. But you were mine first. You were made in horror, but you were born in love. Please know that. Wherever you are, whoever raised you, whatever name they gave you, you were born in love. And if you ever wonder about the woman who gave birth to you, know this. I never forgot. I never stopped looking for your face in crowds. I never stopped wondering if you were warm, if you were happy, if you were loved the way I wanted to love you. They took everything from me, but they couldn't take that 43 seconds. That belongs to me, to us. I hope you had a good life. I hope you never knew what was done. I hope you were happy. I hope you forgive me for not being strong enough to find you. Your mother, Johanna Anna's voice broke. She never sent it. She just wrote it and kept it, like a prayer with no destination. I felt tears in my own eyes. The photograph Greta Richter took, I said after a moment, was an act of witness. She knew what was happening was evil. She documented it so someone someday would know the truth. Your mother was part of that truth, and now, finally, people will know. Will it matter? Anna asked. 80 years later, everyone's gone. The women, the children, the perpetrators. Will it matter? Yes, I said. Because there are still people asking questions. Still children of those children who deserve to know where they came from. Still families with secrets they don't understand. This story matters because the truth always matters, even when it comes too late. Anna wiped her eyes and nodded. Then tell it, she said. Tell my mother's story. Tell all their stories. Make sure people remember what was done to them. And make sure the world knows they weren't collaborators. They were victims. They were prisoners. They were mothers who had everything stolen from them. I will. We sat together for another hour, going through documents, sharing what we knew. When we finally parted, Anna gave me copies of everything she had. The photographs, the medical record, her mother's letter. One more thing, she said as we stood to leave. That woman who took the photograph, Greta Richter, did she survive? She did. She lived until 1989. Did anyone ever thank her for being a witness? I thought of Greta's testimony, sealed and unused. Of the photograph she sent to my grandfather with a letter asking him to tell the story. Of a life spent as a librarian, quiet and unremarkable, carrying the weight of what she had seen. No, I said. I don't think anyone ever did. Then I'm grateful to her now, Anna said. 80 years too late, but I'm grateful. 6 months later, I published the story. I used the photographs. I used Greta's testimony. I used Johanna's letter. I told the truth about Waldhof and the women who built cradles for children they would never hold. The response was immediate. Messages from Germany, France, Poland, Holland. Families who had always wondered about their grandparents' silence. Adopted children who had been told they were pure German, but had always felt something missing in their history. And one email that made my hands shake. It came from a man in Munich, 80 years old, adopted in 1944 by a German family, born in August 1944 at a place called Steinhöring. I think, he wrote, I might be Johanna's son. Munich, Germany. 6 months later. His name was Klaus Weber, or at least that was the name given to him in 1944 by the German family who raised him as their own. We met in a quiet cafe near the Marienplatz, the heart of old Munich. He was 80 years old, tall and lean, with blue eyes that held a lifetime of questions. When he shook my hand, I noticed his grip was firm, but his fingers trembled slightly. Thank you for coming, he said in careful English. I wasn't sure you would. Of course I came. He had brought a folder with him. Adoption papers, birth records, documents he'd carried for decades without fully understanding their weight. He laid them on the table between us like evidence in a trial that had never been held. I always knew I was adopted, he said. My parents, the Webers, they were good people. They never hid it from me. But they said I was born to an unwed German mother who couldn't keep me. That I was chosen, special. He smiled bitterly. That was the word they always used. Special. When did you learn the truth? Not until after they died. I was going through their papers in the 1990s and found my original birth documentation. Steinhöring, Lebensborn. I knew what that meant. He paused. But I didn't know the rest. I didn't know about places like Waldhof. I didn't know about the women. I pulled out the photograph. The one Greta had taken. The one that had started everything. This was taken in November 1943, 4 months before your birth. These women were prisoners, forced into pregnancy, forced to build furniture for the children they would lose. Klaus studied the image with an intensity that made my chest ache. Which one was she? My mother? We can't be certain, but based on the medical records Anna Thornton shared and the dates, I pointed to a figure in the back, partially turned. We believe this might be Johanna, your mother. He stared at the face, blurred by time and motion but unmistakably human. A young woman looking toward a corner filled with cradles she had built but would never use. She was 24, he said softly. the same age as my daughter when she had her first child. I remember holding my grandson the day he was born. I remember that feeling, the weight of him, the absolute terror and joy of it. His voice broke. And she got 43 seconds. Yes. And then they took me away and gave me to strangers. Told her I was being sent to a good family. Made her believe it was for the best. He looked up at me. Do you know what that does to a person? To have your child ripped away and be told you should be grateful for it? I can't imagine. I've spent 6 months thinking about her, Klaus said. Every day since I read your article. Thinking about what she went through, what she carried. I'm 80 years old, and I've just learned that the woman who gave birth to me was a prisoner, that I was born from violence, that my entire existence was part of a machine designed to erase people's humanity. You were also born from 43 seconds of love, I said quietly. She wrote that, in a letter she never sent. She said you were born in love. Klaus closed his eyes. I had a good life, he said after a long moment. The Webers raised me well. I became an engineer. I married. I have 2 children, 4 grandchildren. I've been happy. He opened his eyes. But I've also been incomplete, and I never understood why until now. Have you been in contact with Anna? Johanna's daughter? Yes. We've spoken on the phone. She sent me photographs of her mother, later years after the war. A woman who looked tired but kind, who never spoke about what happened but carried it every day. He pulled out one of the photos Anna had sent him. This was taken in Canada in the 1960s. She's in her garden. I looked at the photograph. An older woman, blonde hair turning gray, kneeling beside roses with dirt on her hands. Her face was peaceful in that moment, caught in the simple act of tending something that would grow. She looks content, I said. She looks like she learned how to survive, Klaus corrected. There's a difference. We talked for 2 hours, about his life, about Johanna's life, as much as we knew of it, about the thousands of children like him, born into Lebensborn programs, raised with lies or half-truths, carrying questions that had no easy answers. What do you want people to know? I asked finally. About your story, about your mother's story. Klaus was quiet for a long time. I want them to know that history isn't abstract, he said. It's not statistics and dates and archived documents. It's people, real people who loved and suffered and survived. My mother was real. She was 24 years old. She was brave enough to hide Jewish refugees. She was strong enough to survive something that should have destroyed her. And she was human enough to write a letter to a son she would never see again. Just so somewhere in the universe those words existed. He touched the photograph of the factory floor. I want people to know that every one of these women had a name, had a life before they were taken, had dreams that were stolen from them. And I want people to know that the children born in that place and were not symbols. We're not political arguments. We're just people trying to understand where we came from. And have you? Understood? Some of it. He folded his hands on the table. I understand that I was born from something terrible and carried by someone extraordinary. I understand that my mother gave me the only gift she could, life itself, even though it cost her everything. And I understand that she loved me in the only way she was allowed to love me. From a distance, in silence. For 43 seconds, that had to last a lifetime. Before I left Munich, Klaus asked me one more question. The woman who took the photograph, Greta, do you know if she had family? No family, she lived alone, worked as a librarian, died quietly. She was a witness, Klaus said, in a time when witnessing was dangerous. She documented the truth when everyone else was destroying evidence. She sent that photograph to your grandfather because she believed someone should know. He paused. I want to honor that. I want to make sure her name is remembered too. I'll make sure it is. We shook hands on the steps of the cafe. An old man and a journalist, connected by a photograph taken 80 years ago in a place that no longer existed, by women whose suffering had been erased from official histories, but not forgotten, never forgotten. I think often about that photograph now, about the 17 women whose faces were captured in that frozen moment, about the cradles they built, about the children they carried and lost, about the decades of silence that followed, about Johanna, who held her son for 43 seconds and loved him for 80 years, about Greta, who pointed her camera at the truth when doing so could have cost her life. About Klaus, who lived 80 good years before learning where his story truly began. And about all the others, the women we couldn't trace, the children who never learned their origins, the families who carried secrets they didn't understand. The photograph still hangs on my wall. Sometimes I look at it and see only the machinery of war, the factory floor, the workstations, the industrial apparatus of a regime built on cruelty. But mostly I see the faces, the bent heads and averted eyes, the hand pressed protectively against a stomach, the woman looking toward the corner, toward the cradles. And I remember that history is not made of armies and borders and political ideologies. It is made of moments. 43 seconds of holding a child you will never see again. A photograph taken in secret because someone believed the truth mattered. A letter written to a son who would never read it. A life built on grief that learned somehow to grow roses. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the promises time refused to keep. But they also hold something else. Proof that even in the darkest places, even when everything was taken, even when silence was safer than speaking, there were witnesses, there were mothers, there was love, and there was truth, waiting patiently in a manila envelope, in a hidden negative, in a box in a closet, waiting for someone to finally see it, waiting for someone to finally say, I remember you. Your name, your face, your 43 seconds, you mattered, you still matter, and your story will not be forgotten.